Hello, everyone. Ann-Kristin, we were asked if we want a moderator, and we said no.
Oh, no, you're moderating. That's what we decided.
Oh, that's
Although
good.
this is not about moderation. Actually, we had a talk in front of Steffi, and then she said, "Oh, why don't you repeat that at DLD?"
Yeah,
it was a total coincidental one we had at Unternehmertum in the collab. Yeah.
No, absolutely. So we were asked to speak at DLD individually, and then we sat in a room and we were talking about deep tech, and Steffi listened and she said, exactly that again on stage, please. So that's what we're going to do today. And maybe I can start with something that really struck my mind last year when traveling through this country. Every narrative was a negative one. It was basically us saying we don't really have a future, we're going down, our economy is no longer compatible, we don't really have the magic sauce anymore, made in Germany is not something we are known for any longer in the world. And then in my role as a chairwoman of the Startup Association, you get to see many companies, startups throughout the country, especially deep tech. And every time you sit there, you're like, this is world class. This is our world-class research and development coming out of our universities, meeting our industrial bases in this country, meeting our engineering talent, and coming together with capital, still not enough, but getting more. Why are we not talking about Proxima Fusion, Marvel Fusion, ESA Aerospace, the exploration company, Plancq, Ionisys, Deep Drive? I could go on forever, much more than always only moaning about what isn't working any longer. And my partner in crime, Ann-Kristin, were you, because you called me every other week and said, I have this amazing company, you have to meet them. It's incredible what they do. And Plancq and Proxima Fusion, we visited them together. And those are the moments where I go home and say, world-class made in Germany or Europe is not only possible, it's happening, but we're not talking about it enough. And we don't put the right ingredients in place to make it bigger. So my first question is, what do we have to do to have more Plancqs, more Proxima Fusions coming out of Germany and Europe, and to kind of show that deep tech could be really our big case where we could champion again?
Yeah, as Verena said, she's my partner in crime, and it's so great if you call Verena, and when I'm enthusiastic, say you have to see, this great case that you take, you take the fire, you take the spark, but it's not only about being enthusiastic and coming to those companies and saying, oh wow, the future is bright. It was also, and that's what you and I discussed before, it's also about understanding the complexity of deep tech entrepreneurship. One thing is we have like these gold nuggets in the ground that, somehow, we have to develop into companies. But the complexities of doing so are not discussed in depth and have to be understood. And one thing I admire about Verena, who's, you're so present, you do so many things, is sitting down really for now and trying to understand, what is needed. And a lot of you will have heard, this is like the European conundrum, that we have so many ground theory, but we don't transfer them into companies. It's a standard thing. It does work. There are more companies than one knows. For example, if you take Max Planck, who are world-renowned, they have founded up to 200, close to 200 companies since the 90s, which is not that publicly known. But if you look at what is needed, it is, yes, a lot of money, if you talk about asset-heavy things like fusion quantum computers, but it's also a mindset of those institutions, whether it's universities, extraordinary institutions like Max Planck and Helmholtz, to spin out, which is a big difference. We discussed you need IP contracts, you need a willingness to do so, you need the teams to do so. Maybe we're going to discuss this, because the idea that every ground theorist should be the one who should also be an entrepreneur is wrong. There's some who are great, but in most cases it's a mixed team. So that's what we discussed in depth in those very different cases of Plancq and Proxima.
Yeah, and I think when looking at the university, and I mean, I don't know if Helmut Schönberger is in the room, but with Unternehmertum, we have a best practice made in Germany where you can really see what happens if you bring a technical university together with entrepreneurship. Because talking about teams, not every engineer is automatically a great entrepreneur, and not every entrepreneur can get given an IP and then execute it in the way it's needed. So what I sometimes see or feel when looking at German universities, Ann-Kristin, is it's not a chip on the shoulder to have companies come out of universities. It's a chip on the shoulder to do research and education. And that's what you're valued for. Yeah. That's where we win the Nobel Prizes of the world. And I think we should be hugely proud of that. But that doesn't mean that we can't put it into practice. Why is it seen as a controversy?
But that's the great point. We have to do both. And if we say, so why didn't more researchers go out and found companies? I mean, the first one is something that I even share. You can have a debate if everything is tax funded in research, whether it shouldn't be open source. And in the US, they started to IP earlier. This is a great debate. Then, you know, we as professors are, and if I say we, because I used to be a professor for a long time, you know, we are in rankings according to research. So if you spend time also supporting students, whatsoever, it's like lost time if you go by that scale. But the third one, it's also a very different mindset. If you're a ground theorist, I mean, you have to have the patience to look for something, you know, for internal times, which is very different from an entrepreneurial mindset, you know? So this is why it's so needed that, for example, you scout them, you bring them to together with others to set up companies. And I think the one thing that is totally underestimated also by institutions is you don't take the IP and throw it over the fence, and then you have a company, but how hard the work is in transforming some great, you know, idea research into a big company.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think by looking at deep tech, and deep tech, for those of you who say, what's deep tech? Deep tech is basically IP-based founding of a company or research-based founding. So where you have really something you can defend, and that's why it's deep tech, which goes very deep into the technology. So when we visited Plancq, they do quantum computing, I know Alexander is here, or Proxima Fusion. It's fascinating to see how much physicists of the past who are now 70 or older say, I want to be part of this, not with equity or with money, but with my brain, because what is happening here could be world-changing.
Exactly, that's a great trend. We had a dinner this week with the president's house of Max Planck, and there were several founders who, exactly as you said, after their career said, we want to found something. It's a totally new dynamism you have here. And it's so important because as you will remember, the Draghi report was quoted several times. It's exactly deep tech that gets out of that middle technology trap, and is so important for the future of the restructuring of the industry.
Absolutely. But then if you have all that, and if you say, okay, the universities come up with world research, we have the people, what is then always the big problem is the capital. Because you need more capital for deep tech, and you need it over a longer period of time. And what happens in the US, for example, is the state becomes the customer of these startups very early. So they buy a SpaceX rocket ship years before it is even able to take off. Versus here, we finance this entirely with private money because the state says this is too far down the road, this is none of our business. And I question that, because we wouldn't have an Airbus if it wouldn't have been a political will to have it. Why are we so reluctant to go as a state early into startups as a customer? You don't have to give taxpayer money, but you can buy the rocket ship of ESA Aerospace and then make sure that we ship our own satellites to space and we're not dependent on Elon Musk.
No, you're absolutely right. A lot of those industries would not have developed without the state in various forms. But we do see a shift. We're rather bad in that, but we do see a shift here. And I think the industry where you see it most is new space. Where it's also, you know, on the national, but also on the European level, that you must come from funding something to, you know, becoming a client. We also had Rafael Laguna yesterday. They're also thinking about, you know, different forms of supporting stuff. And that is so important. For example, if you look at fusion, you could, for example, imagine that you would already buy something up front and that by way finance. You know, it's much too short to only think in venture capital dimensions.
Yeah.
So the state is important, but it's also, one thing is the state being a client. The other one is the state supporting, and we see that very well in France. A lot of the deep tech stuff has other states as clients, so you need political support, you know, whether it's the president, whether it's the ambassador, if you negotiate with other countries. And you also need the state to know which countries to work with. Yeah. So the state has different roles in here.
Yeah. And I think that is so important, because what we're currently doing is we're building a ramp of amazing companies for the world, and we take the early risk until 50 million, and then when we hit 50 million in capital per startup, we don't have funds that are large enough to finance the further growth. And then the non-European investors come and say, oh, cherry picking, that's great. I'd like that company. And this actually fits very well into my fusion strategy. And oh, this could be a good addition to SpaceX. And so that's why I think it's important that the capital flows into larger growth funds here in Europe. That's why an initiative like the TechStar initiative on the European level is really important, because it matches the fund capacities to make them bigger and larger. But there again, Macron said a few years ago, I want France to be a startup nation. And France excelled in that regard.
Oh, absolutely.
And we are not a startup nation, and we didn't have politicians in the last years or even decades who said, and startup nation doesn't mean we only care about startups, it's kind of this mindset we mean with it. So how will we attract more capital to Germany and Europe if the US and China are so far ahead of us?
I think the first thing is to see what we have here substance-wise, you know, and we have to change our systems. We don't have a pension fund system, but we have a lot of money that can be used in a way that is also financially much more attractive, you know, because it does make sense if you look at the risk-reward to invest here, which will also be state money, for example, if you think of the money that is in the states funds like the Atom Fund and so, and they're changing. If you look at the WIN initiative, they're working on new concepts also as a state, how to invest.
Yeah, the WIN initiative is really interesting. It's insurers, pension funds, companies like Henkel Telecom, who committed 12 billion in the next 5 years directly into growth phase venture capital, not via the states. So that's a big hope.
That's already, you know, it you know, exemplifies the change. But then let me make another point. We researched a lot at TU Munich about why entrepreneurs, why startup companies leave Germany or why they leave Europe. And the interesting thing is, it's not only about the amount of money they need, and that's a very important point, but it's also about the smartness of the money. And I think if we go into deep tech, you cannot at the same time judge quantum and fusion, whatsoever. It's all very different, robotics, a new space. We have to develop, and we see the first companies like WeSquared and others, we have to develop specialized venture capital funds, and we need the people who come from the technical side to work hand in hand there.
Yeah, absolutely. When thinking about the ecosystems we have in Germany, so the Deutsche Mittelstand, the corporates, the universities, the startups, they're often very separated. You go to a Mittelstandskonferenz, you don't meet any startups. You go to a startup conference, you meet very little Mittelstand. There are a few melting pots. I mean, DLD is an example, or the hinterland of things in Bielefeld, of all places. I come from Bielefeld, so I'm very proud of that conference. But it's not that we're really mixing our strength or that we're joining forces. How can we make that happen more? Because if I go to Proxima, it's Bilfinger Berger working together with them to build the power plant at some point in time. If I go to other companies, it's the big hidden champions from all over Germany who are teaming up to make this world-class companies happen. Why aren't we making more of what we have instead of always traveling to other countries to look at what we should be doing?
I think you're talking about the most important point that needs change, you know, because we would have that huge potential and we work less, you know, at the intersection than what is done in the States. And it's good for both sides, because also as an incumbent, you need the various forms of strategy. And that would be my biggest wish, that those companies, and that would be a wish to you who are from the industrial side here, to be more open to talk to the startups. For example, I know that Heike Freund is here from Marvel, whom you mentioned, with energy companies, or Alex and Quantum, because it's not only about the money. The important thing is you have to develop stuff together. You know, it's a mindset and it's an intellectual thing, you know, that only together can you develop the kind of support that is helpful and not off the shelf.
And you were just mentioning earlier that we don't really allocate money into innovation at an institutional level with our pension funds. And I mean, we have many family offices in this country. And I often wonder, like, if it is a long time horizon, deep tech. It can be up to 10 years, it can be 15, it can be 5. It's not something that breaks through the next day or where you have the prototype in place soon after you fund it. But isn't it kind of a time where we should be allocating the masses of capital that we have in this country? If we wouldn't have any capital, we would say, okay, tough luck, so we don't really have a chance. But we have the capital, we're just not investing it into innovation. Isn't it the time also now for family office to look more at this kind of things? Because those are the things where I feel Europe has a real stand in the future and isn't only dependent on those industries we already have.
No, yeah, absolutely right. It's the family offices, and we have this great example of the Schwingmans and BioNTech. You know, I guess most people in the room have been vaccinated only thanks to that initiative, and it does make sense. But it's also about the family-owned companies, because that's what we know. Because they have a different corporate governance, they can even take more risk. Yeah. You know, they have shorter ways. You spoke about hinterland, and it would be great, you know, if we had that kind of move in Germany, you know, for everyone's benefit.
Yeah, so thank you very much, and maybe to address everyone in the room, and so that everyone takes home some homework where he or she can do something, the journalists. I think portraying these companies more in the media, going to these companies, listening to what they are doing and what they are building, and trying to translate that into a language that 83 million Germans and Europeans understand what we are building there is also crucial, because obviously if you stay on the buzzword level and say, oh, quantum computing is important, oh, and fusion energy is really great, none of us really knows, can you tell me exactly what it is and how it will change my life and why it will benefit, why I will benefit from it? And I think these stories in the media would also do a big leap forward to shine some light to those companies. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.